Canada's Aboriginal women make up a small fraction of its population, yet for decades they've suffered disproportionately from abuse, exploitation and murder. Amid mounting claims of official indifference to a problem that some say has its roots in racism and the country's colonial past, Sarah Spiller asks why police and government aren't doing more to tackle crimes against Canada's First Nation females.
Thunder Bay in Ontario, Canada. In the teeth of winter on Valentine's Day, a walk to remember lost loved ones. Aboriginal people are the Indigenous people of Canada. Aboriginal women make up 4% of the female population. Yet during the last 3 decades, they've accounted for around 16% of all female homicides. And the disproportionate numbers of Aboriginal women who've gone missing or been murdered in this country has been called a national tragedy. Over 1,000 Aboriginal women have disappeared or met violent deaths here since 1980. Sharon Johnson still mourns her sister.
This was my little sister here, Sandra. Yesterday would have been 23, right? I don't know. I always have to count how many years it's been since we lost her. It's not something, I guess, I want to remember.
We travelled to 3 provinces in this prosperous country. On our journey, we heard allegations about those charged with protecting Aboriginal women's safety and claims that in some cases the National Police Force were part of the problem. And that the roots of violence against Aboriginal women could be traced back to a bitter inheritance from Canada's colonial past. Fort William First Nation Reserve, outside Thunder Bay, on the shores of Lake Superior. GEORJANN MORRISEAU grew up here and is a former chief.
Squaw Bay.
Yeah, Squaw Bay.
Where does that name come from?
That name is a settler name. It's a derogatory name for First Nation women. I'd say it'd be comparable to calling a woman like a wench, a slut, something like that.
Like others, GEORJANN MORRISEAU believes this perception of Aboriginal women is but one part of damage wrought by colonialism. One of the most pernicious legacies, she told us, removing Aboriginal children from their families, putting over 150,000 children in residential schools, which became notorious for abuse. The last of these schools closed in the 1990s.
The residential schools were to take the Indian out of the child. It still impacts the families today because those who went to residential school often lost their parenting skills. They also brought back a legacy of abuse for themselves. They'd come back home to their own parents and family who had taken to drinking and alcohol and abuse of themselves because they had their children taken away, and you kind of lose your purpose.
It's said the results of this and other policies have impacted on generations right up to present times, and that when women leave Aboriginal reserves, more problems can lie ahead in Canada's cities.
They don't come down to the city with any kind of level of education because in our reserves we don't have schools. You know, leaving a remote community where you know everybody to come to like a metropolis, you know, and Thunder Bay ain't even that big. Like you take somewhere like Toronto and Vancouver, you're lost.
I started to forget who she was. So like I forgot what she sounded like, you know what I mean?
I got you on video.
Cheyenne Fox's family remember a happy childhood, living in Thunder Bay and on Indigenous reserves. The mother of a young son with dreams for the future.
So she had a lot of friends at school and very bubbly most times. She always had a good outlook on life and all that.
I think when she moved to the city, that's where it really, like, you know, reality hit her, and she couldn't take that type of pressure of the city.
Cheyenne's family say her life in Toronto became troubled. They say she was assaulted, became homeless, got involved in sex work to survive. Cheyenne's body was found in a Toronto suburb. She'd fallen from an apartment block. Her family say that on the night of her death, there were emergency calls. They say a man was with her.
What I think happened is he beat her, and while she was drunk, and in order to make it look like suicide, he tossed her body over.
For the last 2 years, the family have been challenging a police verdict that Cheyenne's death was suicide.
They just ruled it as suicide and they closed the books.
I think they disregarded her because she wasn't your average Canadian woman with a good job, you know, education, homeless. But the fact that she was Aboriginal, you know, pretty much threw it out like that, like, you know, garbage in a dumpster, you know what I mean?
Toronto Police Service told us their position was clear. The death of Cheyenne Fox was the subject of a thorough investigation. Her ethnicity played no role whatsoever in the investigation. Winnipeg in the province of Manitoba, and a mural to commemorate Aboriginal women who've been murdered or gone missing here. By the banks of the Red River, another tribute, this time to a 15-year-old Aboriginal girl found here last August. A loss that led the community to take matters into their own hands, dragging this huge river in the hope of finding other remains, other evidence.
When you find a 15-year-old wrapped in, you know, a garbage bag, disposed in like their garbage in the river, this affects us all, whether you're Indigenous or not. We had pushed the police to do more, you know, to search the river more. We had hoped that they would have been the one to drag the river, but unfortunately, you know, they were not going to do it. That was the whole premise of us doing something, because of their lack of response to it and not having confidence in what they were doing in terms of action to find, you know, our women.
Bernadette's own sister went missing in 2008, aged 21.
Every day, phone rings. You know, you don't know if that's the call that the police are going to tell you that they found her, or the doorbell ringing, you know. Is that her at the door? Like, you just, you know, you're always wondering.
NAHANNI Fontaine is one of many Aboriginal activists who've raised the issue over many years of the disproportionate numbers of Aboriginal women going missing or being murdered in this country.
You know, for years and years, families were, you know, trying to bring attention to this issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And for the most part, it fell on deaf ears. Nobody cared. I think that you would probably have a consensus across the country that families and community felt that policing institutions didn't necessarily take those complaints seriously and didn't do, you know, the police actions that they needed to do.
The country's national force, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, finally produced a report last year with their official figures. 1,017 Aboriginal women murdered between 1980 and 2012. 164 Aboriginal women missing. We approached the Royal Canadian Mounted Police for an interview and a response to our questions. They didn't provide either. When they released findings on the numbers of missing and murdered Aboriginal women in Canada last year, the RCMP said the data filled a significant gap and should serve as a foundation on which to target crime prevention and crime reduction efforts, along with information for communities and all levels of government. Back in the Thunder Bay, an institution for female young offenders. When we visited, all the young women locked up here were Aboriginal. Director Brenda CRYDERMAN told us she had no doubt what lay behind the jailing of girls in her custody.
Mostly our kids are traumatized kids. And yes, they may have committed something because they're drinking or hurt or scared or running. I don't know. It's racism. I mean, it's the bottom line is that's who we lock up.
Today they have a visit from a woman who was incarcerated here as a youngster. Bridget Perrier tells them about growing up in Thunder Bay, about her vulnerability as an Aboriginal girl, and how she ended up in the sex trade.
Each of you guys a piece of paper, and you're gonna write a secret. And I'll borrow one of your pencils, because I'm gonna be a part of this activity too, because I got many secrets. Being adopted, I didn't fit in. Everything I did was blamed on me being an Indian. And I was adopted to people that didn't understand the culture. And they resented my Native heritage, and my survival mechanism was to hoe, to go out there and sell my ass. I slept with someone for protection, for a place to stay. I slept with someone to feed my habit. And I slept with a lot of men for money. I am a survivor of prostitution. I was trafficked at the age of 12 out of the city of Thunder Bay.
Bridget Perrier told us how men viewed Aboriginal women they paid for sex.
You know, I remember talking with a client and him just asking me my background, and I got comfortable, and he was really shocked when I told him I was Native. And he's like, oh, I never stricken you as that. He's like, because I like Natives, they're stupid. And I was like, whoa.
By the shores of Lake Superior, Bridget Perrier described how things escalated for her as a young girl. She says she was recruited from a brothel to be used for sex aboard a ship traveling to the US.
It was scary because the captain told me things that, like, if someone gets out of line, he'll throw her off the ship. And I knew Lake Superior. I grew up on the lake. So for me, it was scary. I don't know how many of these guys are bringing girls on, but I know in every port city, there's stories about the women. Trafficking charges need to be laid down.
The prairies in Manitoba. Here we heard further concerns about the vulnerabilities of Aboriginal women and girls to an extreme form of violence, sex trafficking across this vast country. In Manitoba's capital, Winnipeg, we met activists who support Aboriginal families. DIANE REDSKY headed a $2 million national task force on sex trafficking for a leading Canadian charity.
They end up trauma bonded to the trafficker. They think this is what love is, and they're taught that by the traffickers, that this is sex and this is love. And especially for Aboriginal girls coming from a First Nation community, it is sort of normalized abuse because we have our own history of colonization and what that impact has had on specifically Aboriginal girls.
Alima Kaiva is a transgender woman. After sexual abuse and bullying on a reserve, she came here to Winnipeg, where she was picked up by a gang and trafficked around Canada. She told us about friends on the streets here whom she's lost.
Yeah. This is my friend Jeeves Boulanger, who was last seen alive right here getting into a black pickup truck, a Toyota Datsun, and was found approximately 40-ish days later, murdered.
Indigenous people don't choose to go missing or murdered. We don't choose to be on the street corners and survival sex work. There are a lot of survivors from human trafficking, such as myself, and exploitation.
On our journey here, we were told about one difficulty in assessing the scale of this crime when it comes to Aboriginal women and girls: distrust of the police.
There's an overrepresentation of Aboriginal women in Canada that are being trafficked, and we know women are not reporting. So we know that they are experiencing way more violence than other women, that they end up being trafficked for longer.
The RCMP didn't respond to our questions about Aboriginal women and girls and human trafficking. In a report on domestic human trafficking for sexual exploitation in Canada, the RCMP said that several specific cases involved Aboriginal victims. They noted the extent of this crime and the number of victims remained underreported. Vancouver in British Columbia on Canada's west coast. Events that unfolded in the downtown east side of this city were to become a defining moment in this country's story of missing and murdered Aboriginal women and policing. When women started disappearing from these streets in the 90s, families say nobody seemed to care. The reason? The women were poor, many addicted, many sex workers, many Aboriginal. An estimated 67 women went missing. The DNA of 33 women was found on a farm outside Vancouver. 12 were Aboriginal. Robert Picton, the owner of the farm, was convicted of 6 women's deaths, charged with 20, and suspected of many more. He became one of Canada's most infamous serial killers. In 2012, an inquiry ruled that systemic bias and blatant failures by the Vancouver Police Department and the RCMP allowed Picton to keep taking women from these streets. Angel Wolfe lost her mother Brenda.
And so you kept all the articles about your mom and about the downtown east side and so
Everything,
on?
Yeah. Anything that mentioned Picton or mentioned like the women or like anything like that, it just automatically got put into that book. And the system failed all those women on the downtown east side. These women were mothers. Let's stop calling them whores and prostitutes and crack addicts and all those like names. Like these were vulnerable women and they were loved and valued.
Official figures suggest only a small minority of Aboriginal women who've been murdered in Canada over the last 3 decades have been sex workers. But the appalling story of police failure here continues to raise searching questions. For some, like Angela MacDougall, these go to the heart of relations between Aboriginal people, policing and the national force, the RCMP.
We have to understand that the very making of, the creation of the RCMP in Canada was created to move Indigenous people off the lands. So we have to understand those roots. Those roots are real, and they are playing out on a daily basis, all across the lands in terms of how RCMP do policing in primarily Indigenous areas or within the rural areas or within their jurisdiction.
Northern British Columbia. Winding through this wild landscape, Highway 16, a route that for some has come to symbolize despair and heartache over losses. This road connects isolated communities living in remote reaches of the province. With little reliable public transport, for some the only option has been to hitch, a factor, it's thought, that may have led to violent deaths and disappearances here. Official figures put these at 18. Others believe the numbers of those missing and murdered in this area could be far higher, very many of these Aboriginal women and girls. A route that has come to be known as the Highway of Tears. For these families and activists, what's happened on the Highway of Tears is about the way Aboriginal lives are valued.
A story of systemic racism. For example, when Nicole Hoare went missing, she was non-Aboriginal, and there was a large initiative, a big concerted effort that went towards finding Nicole, finding out what happened to her. There was supports for her family. Well, none of that happened for these First Nations women, and that is not acceptable. Because you are a First Nations girl or woman, your life doesn't matter as much as if you're non-Indigenous.
Mary Teegee lost her cousin Ramona.
The perceptions around the missing and murdered Aboriginal women is that, they're prostitutes, they live this high-risk lifestyle. That wasn't the case in many of these cases. That sure enough wasn't the case for my little cousin Ramona.
In their home in Smithers, Matilda and Brenda Wilson remember Ramona, a daughter and sister, aged 16. Ramona left one June night to visit a friend. Her body was discovered 10 months later.
The RCMP came in to show us her clothing. It was pretty devastating. And when we got out of there, my sisters were all kind of screaming and crying, and brothers were all crying. And it's very hard.
Her murder is unsolved. When a murder is unsolved or if your loved one is missing, you don't have that peace in your heart, and it really is hard to move on. We just want to understand why this is, why there are no answers to these cases. It's not acceptable to our families, and it's not acceptable to our communities that we don't have the answers.
On top of frustrations over unsolved cases on the highway of tears, there are more questions about the RCMP in this province. 2 years ago, Human Rights Watch accused RCMP officers of serious violations against Aboriginal women and girls here, including physical and sexual abuse. A Canadian civil liberties organisation told us that since this report, they've heard further anecdotal claims about the RCMP in this province.
While it's hard to say that in any particular case that racism played a part, it certainly raises the question when we see over the string of years many instances, invariably involving First Nations individuals, of excessive force being used in interactions with police. It starts to paint a very troubling picture. And this is how it's viewed by the community. We hear this from community members themselves.
A photo from last December of an elderly Aboriginal woman taken to the ground by an RCMP officer in the town of Smithers. We understand Irene Joseph was approached outside a shop where an investigation was underway and she was not under arrest. Irene Joseph told us she's still recovering from this and has made a complaint against the RCMP.
She was thrown to the ground off of her walker and ended up with big, huge bruises all over her arms. And for one of our matriarchs to be treated that way affirms that it's not safe. I've had so many women say to me, why would I ever call the RCMP?
The RCMP didn't respond to our questions about policing in British Columbia. In the case of Irene Joseph, we understand the RCMP position is that they detained an individual who did not comply with verbal direction. In the past, responding to the Human Rights Watch report, the RCMP said they took the allegations very seriously. They've also said that the unimaginable loss and pain felt by families and loved ones of missing and murdered persons was felt across communities. They looked forward to working with government, partners and communities to provide Canadians with the professional and accountable police service they expected and deserved. But with every loss here, the demand for action gets ever more vocal. This March, yet another international committee joined those calling for a national inquiry into why so many Aboriginal women have gone missing or been murdered in this country. A call that's been rejected by Canada's government. The Prime Minister's response: this was not what he termed a sociological phenomenon. This was a matter for the police. For many families, community leaders, activists, a comment which entirely misses the point.
Canada is based on colonization and really is based on the oppression and discrimination of Indigenous people. Tie that with long-standing denial of violence against women generally, link that together, and we have this perfect storm of apathy.
The RCMP has said it will shortly be publishing an update to its 2014 report on missing and murdered Aboriginal women, but no date has yet been announced for its release.